Okay, so you often talk about your work as related to fiction writing. What do you see as the connections between the two, and how has it affected your work?
Yeah, so besides painting, I think the art form that maybe I most am engaged in is reading fiction. I've always loved to read fiction, and so I think it was probably inevitable that it would start to creep into my work. But I think it also fiction has a lot of qualities that I think could be really valuable in a painting. Um, I really love the kind of work of fiction where it's not necessarily so much about plot or some sort of spectacular thing happening, but it's more about giving you a portrait of a person or a relationship or a scenario. Sort of like you feel like you've kind of gotten a chance to live their life in a kind of nuanced way, right? It's not sort of no one's telling you what exactly to feel about this person, right? Like they're not neither good nor bad. They're like a real human, which is probably have good traits and bad traits, and they're complicated, and you're sort of left to draw your own conclusions. You see what they do, and you and you can decide, are they a monster, are they not? And I think that's a really I'm interested in making paintings that sort of tell stories that are about the world that we're living in, that are representational. So I think that kind of nuance is something that really attracts me um, as something to aspire to in painting, which I think can be quite difficult and something I'm still sort of trying to work my way through or figure out how to do. Because it's quite easy in painting, right, to make everything look beautiful. And it's also easy to make everything look incredibly grotesque and like sort of cartoonish. And that often feels to me like pointing a finger at something and saying like, this thing is bad, this thing is good. And that to me is not a very satisfying experience. And even if your goal is sort of to convince someone of that, I don't think that's like a great way to convince them. But I do think what painting can do really well is it can bring out a beauty in everything, but a beauty that is not like an artificial beauty, not a beauty of like them airbrushed, right? It's like you can make you can make someone you can sort of bring the humanity out in someone and make someone really stop and pay attention, say if I'm doing a portrait, without changing their hair and like giving them Botox and putting a lot of makeup. I can paint them as they are, but like the act of painting them and the care with which I paint them can sort of make you look at them maybe in a new way. So that's sort of what I'm interested in thinking about in relationship to fiction. And I think in a lot of ways maybe they're not natural metaphors for each other. And I think that's kind of interesting. I think it's an interesting problem to take something that maybe painting isn't meant to do and try to make painting do that, just sort of as a way to sort of shake up your understanding of what to do and sort of force you to come up with new solutions. But I think they sort of I think what they maybe both can do really well is by focusing on something very mundane, then open up to something larger. And you maybe notice that a lot of my work, I'm interested in sort of painting the everyday objects of our lives. But they're objects that I feel like have this metaphorical potential to sort of speak about someone's larger life. And hopefully the way in which I'm painting it also creates the sort of emotional content that gives you a larger story. And that's something that I see in a lot of the fiction I admire. Um, and then just sort of like continuing my interest in this, I'm at the very beginnings of exploring like, okay, well, what would it actually mean to incorporate text into the work that I'm doing? And so I've done a little bit of work in that area of like, maybe these paintings need text that goes alongside them. Maybe there's a work of text and image that could live alongside these paintings. I think one thing just sort of practically that I really love about the experience of reading a book, it's so personal, it's so accessible in a lot of ways. If you have access to a library and you hear about a book, you're curious, you can just sort of go request it, take it home, read it. It's not like no one has to know that you read it. You can have your own experience, you can draw your own conclusions, and you don't have to have a lot of money to do it. And in some ways, that's one of the sort of problems of being a painter, I think, because sort of the market realities of painting is that it's a luxury good, right? You spend a lot of time on this one thing, and if you sell it, it's probably going to be for an amount of money, even if you're not like a famous painter, that is kind of prohibitive for a lot of people. And especially if you're not, a super famous artist, maybe it's not even going to be shown in museums. And so people outside of New York, aren't going to get to the gallery to see your work in a group show or something. Or even if it is in a museum, only certain, not everyone gets to go to a museum or lives near a museum. But at the same time, right, we talked about painting having this presence in person and it being so layered. And so it's not quite a substitute to say, okay, well, I put my paintings on the line and you can go look at them on the internet. Like, okay, definitely that's useful and that's been helpful for me. I've discovered a lot of painters that way, but it's really not the experience that I'm trying to convey. And so that's been sort of an ongoing interest of mine, thinking about, is there a version of my work that exists as, a book or as a zine or something that exists like to be in that medium, that could be a kind of my work that is distributed in a much more democratic way than my paintings might sort of necessarily be able to be distributed.
Yeah, I agree with your point. It seems that this is more like it should definitely be like more accessible for all, right?
Yeah, and I think it's just a really hard problem to think about, like, how do you do that practically, right? And I think if you talk to most artists and say, like, who do you imagine your audience to be, or like, who do you want to really love your art? It's maybe they want other artists to see it. They want people who are sort of like them when they were younger, right? Like people who loved art. If those people are going to see it, if those people are having a strong reaction to it, right? That's so gratifying. And it's maybe less exciting to think of somebody who's uber wealthy buying your art as an investment property and putting it in a warehouse where they never see it, right? Like, that's kind of depressing to think about. And yet it's like, that enters a whole economic question, right? And so I think there's a lot of work that can be done to sort of reimagine the way art objects transfer through the world. But also I know that I'm one person and I want to spend my time painting and maybe not reimagining economic systems as I think necessary as that work is. So I feel like maybe my small way of participating in that could be to also create something that is a satisfying object in its own right, but is able to be distributed much more democratically.